Hello, everyone. I'm just going to give it another few minutes to start. In the meantime, for those who will be staying long enough for us to practice a paper, towards the end, I'll be going over the specimen paper for 2024. So if you want, in the meantime, आप लोग को download कर लो. Specimen paper 2024 जो है, the 1123, that's what we'll be going over in the end. So if you want, you can just download that, paper 2. All right? All right, I think we've waited long enough. I can begin. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Halima, and we will be going over a recap for paper 2, since that's the paper you have on Monday. And after that, I will be going over the specimen paper as well. I will also be going over sample questions for all directed writing formats so that you have an idea of what to expect in the paper. All right, because your specimen paper, you have the article writing questions, but obviously there are other formats involved as well. So we'll be going over modified papers for those as well. Okay, so I'll start off with a brief recap of the content of paper 2, which will include your section 1 and section 2, which is going to be directed writing and composition. Once we've gone over the general ideas involved with these, we will go over sample papers for each. All right. If at any point you have any questions or you think it's really important that you can't wait till the end, just raise your hand and we can talk about it. Okay, so we'll have questions in the end. Someone just asked what's expected in the paper. Obviously, there's no way of really knowing since this is the first paper for this format. I'm expecting an article, but that's just because it's in specimen paper, but we have to prepare for everything. Okay, so as long as you have your evaluation technique sorted, it should be good to go. All right. Okay, so we will start off with a little bit of a breakdown of the paper. All right. You should expect 2 sections within your paper 2, the writing paper, which is going to be section 1, directed writing, jahan pe you'll be expected to write 250 to 350 words for one of the following, which is either going to be a letter, email, article, speech, or a report. So that's going to be section 1, 25 marks. And then you have composition, which is your essay, jahan pe you have your descriptive essay or narrative. You will be given 4 options, 2 for descriptive, 2 for narrative. Just may say you will be choosing one and writing 350 to 450 words. Right? Okay, so directed writing is the section that has the most modified format. So we're going to go over that first. Sabse pehle, the biggest change that you need to expect for the paper is that now you are not simply expected to produce a directed writing response, but instead you are also given reference text. So basically you will be given 1 or 2 texts, which will be about 400 to 450 words in length. Once you have read those, you will be expected to identify points, identify ideas, arguments, or facts presented within, and then you'll be given a question using which you will be formulating a response. Now, the difference here is you're not expected to completely come up with the entire idea that revolves around your response. So you're not coming up with the points that you're including, you're not starting from scratch. You have a reference text. And it's really important that you keep this in mind. Students who fail to replicate their understanding of the reference text, no matter how good your response is, if it doesn't show that you have used the text, you will not be able to score well. So please make sure that the reference text is incorporated within your response. Okay? So yes, Umair, you seem to have a really important question. Ji, Umair? You can unmute yourself.
जी मिस, मुझे सिर्फ पूछना था, सॉरी टू इंटरप्ट, ये क्लास की ड्यूरेशन क्या होगी?
Okay, so I'm hoping to finish within the hour. Because I basically want to focus on directed writing because that's the section that most students face trouble in, even to this point, because this is something that you're not familiar with. Okay? So I'll try to keep it within the hour. Okay, if it goes on longer, then obviously that would be for the practice. So it's okay if you skip that. But I'll go over the main things within the hour. Okay? All right. So once you have your reference text in front of you, you will be expected to use that in order to develop a response in which you're not only rephrasing or summarizing ideas, but you're also evaluating concepts or your own opinions based on what you have read. So the information that's given to you, you're expected to read that, formulate an understanding, evaluate points. We'll talk over what the word evaluate means later on, and then formulate a response that will be a combination of either discursive, argumentative, or persuasive tone. Okay, so pehle you used to, write argumentative essays separately, but up this is part of your response. So you may be expected to argue between two contrasting points of view, where you are towards the end giving your own opinion and formulating a persuasive section where you're maybe persuading the individual on a particular matter. Okay? All of these apply to all formats, which are your speech, email, report, letter, or article. Okay? One more thing that students need to keep in mind when they are going over the writing section is that the word limit plays a very important role in the way you formulate a response. So the planning process is very important, because if you end up using too many words to talk about, the reference text, and then you don't focus enough on your own opinion, or vice versa, you will end up either writing more than you need to or not enough. And that is something that plays a part in your writing score. Okay? So just keep these two things in mind. Some samples for questions that you can expect other than articles. Now, article writing ka sample to aapke paas hai in your specimen paper, but other than that, for example, if you are expected to write a letter, so the first section over here, it gives you a sample of a letter question where you are being asked to write a letter to your head teacher, which is in which you're explaining why or why not you would want to see artificial intelligence used in your school. So obviously you can expect that iske saath you will be given reference text, jahan pe they'll be talking about contrasting views about AI in the school, and then you'll be expected to formulate a response based on that. Similarly, if we are to write a speech, for example, you read a text that is going to talk about contrasting views, and then you are writing a speech for school leavers about attitudes towards work, which is their professional life. You'll notice that all of these questions have 2 bullet points, which are very similar now. They're not very specific to the question, but they're very generic in terms of what the question expects. So you're basically asked to, number one, evaluate the views, opinions, or facts given within the text. And secondly, you're giving your own opinion based on what you have read about the matter. Now, the reason why it is important to keep in mind that it says based on what you have read. So ISME, the evaluation process, plays a very important role, because whatever you read in the text, you will basically be formulating ideas based on that. All right, I'll be going over examples for all of this. So just keep in mind that the evaluation process, this is what you're being graded for. You're not being graded for summarizing the text. So as long as you are including the points that are within the text, fine, you'll get a score for incorporating the information. But evaluation is also important. So agar aapne usko evaluate nahi kiya hai, you're just summarizing or rephrasing, then you may lower your band, no matter how good your response overall is. So you have to keep in mind, whatever you've read, once you've identified those points, you have to evaluate ideas based on that. Question yourself. Are there any ideas that correspond with what you've just read? Is there something that you can, okay, what do I mean by evaluation? That's actually what we're going to talk about right now. Okay? Once you've all understood the idea that आपका जो text है, उसमें आपने 2 चीजें करनी है, identify करना और evaluate करना है. Identify करने का मतलब ये होता है that you're identifying, number one, the type of text you're given and the type of text you're expected to produce. Once you've done that, the next thing, you identify who your audience is and what the purpose of your response is supposed to be. Once these 3 things have been identified, the next thing is to evaluate. Evaluation hoti kya hai? Basically, it means that you're going to read your text, you're going to analyze all the points that you can point out that correspond with the question at hand. The question will state what idea they want you to focus on. So I'm going to go back to one of the questions here. For example, इसमें जैसे उन्होंने लिखा है, the first one says that imagine you are a pupil at a school which is considering introducing artificial intelligence in the classroom. ठीक है? And they're saying you need to write a letter to the head teacher explaining why you would or would not want to go with this idea. Now, iski evaluation basically ye hogi that no matter what the points are, for example, they're talking about how AI makes, I'm just giving you an example right now. We will go over the text as well. So, for example, the text says that AI is beneficial because it is going to make the learning process quicker. All right, so it's going to save a lot of time. So if time is a factor that you've identified within the text, the next thing you need to do, the evaluation basically for this point could be talking about whether that time saved is beneficial in contrast with the cons of AI. So if I'm saving time, but at the same time, I'm crippling myself of thinking, then if this contrast is something that you're able to formulate, this is something that you can incorporate as your evaluation. So for example, if I state that AI is encouraged within schools or the education system because it is going to make the learning process quicker and more convenient for students. However, one must question, now the statement that I'm saying right now, this is evaluation. However, one must question, is this time saved worth the crippling effect AI might have on students and their critical reasoning? So this is the evaluation. This is what evaluation means. Any ideas that I can associate with the idea that already has been stated within the text. So once you've read both views, you will be able to come up with your own ideas that you can use to bridge these two ideas. Isko evaluation kehte hain. So you're developing your own ideas, you're developing your own opinions. I'm not using the word opinions only because there are concepts that you can bring out from the text as well. So that's why this is what evaluation is. You're evaluating a point and seeing whether or not this holds as a general idea or not. Because the text will generically be about AI, for example. Or let me give you another example. For example, you're asked to write a response on the idea of animal testing. So if that is something that is being discussed within your text, without reading the text, we can all agree on the idea that yes, there are benefits to animal testing, there are drawbacks to animal testing. Agar wo kehte that animal testing is the most convenient way to make medicines available for the general public. Now, my evaluated point could be, is their life not worth the same as a human's life? Now, this may not be mentioned within the text, but if I'm talking about saving lives as human lives, an evaluated point could be, what about animal lives? I hope that clarifies the idea of evaluation a little bit at least. Okay, so evaluation ka basically matlab ye hota hai that you're highlighting ideas or coming up with ideas and opinions based on a point that's given within the text. So any questions that arise in your mind, any ideas that you can associate with the text already given, ye hoti hai evaluation. Okay, if not clear already, let me give you a breakdown of the entire directed writing process. So basically, when we are going over, now this applies to all formats. The first thing that you do, you've read your text, you've read your question, and you have understood generally what the main idea or argument or point of view within each text or that particular text is. That's step one. Once this is done, the next thing you do is you read the text again and you identify points that you would incorporate within your response. Now, once you've read the entire text, there may be points that you don't think will fit well with the question at hand. All right, so you don't need to worry about how many points. Generically, it varies from text to text. It will usually be balanced. For example, agar aapke paas do texts hain, so on an average, overall 10 points to aapke ban jayenge in a combination. 10 points so you will be able to identify from the text. It may not be a balanced argument. It may be a balanced argument. That depends on the topic. Okay, but rest assured, you will be able to identify at least 10 points from within both texts or that one particular text. Okay, so one thing that I want you all to understand, don't confuse yourself with the idea, I was only able to identify 8 points. Now what do I do? Don't worry about it. Yes, agar aapse bilkul identify nahi ho rahe, then that's something to worry about. But quick counting nahi hoti. There's no actual number that they say ki itne evaluate hone chahiye. So it's going to be different for every question, but there will be at least 10 points, okay, that you should be able to identify from the entire reference text together. Okay? So once you've identified those points from both the texts, you highlighted what each point of view says, because it will be contrasting. There will be 2 points of view. Once you've highlighted those, yes, from both texts, combined karke, there will be probably 10 or maybe more, but 10 to hongi for sure. So once you've identified those ideas from both the texts, technically the evaluation applies to the entire text. So you're evaluating every point. आप इस तरह नहीं करें कि you're evaluating just one idea or one point of view and then the other. You're basically evaluating every point. So if you look at this section over here, I'll talk about discursive and argumentative in just a minute. All right. So this is the planning process that we're talking about. Someone just asked me if we should be planning. This is the planning process that we're talking about. So this is your planning process. So you read your text, you're identifying all of this is your planning process. Okay? So once you have identified your questions, the next thing that you need to keep in mind is that each point is going to have an opinion associated with it in your mind. You're going to obviously be able to look at a question. I don't know if this will probably be uploaded on YouTube later. Yes, probably will be. All right. So just keep in mind that every point needs to be evaluated. Every point needs to go through step number 3, which is to talk about whether or not you agree with this idea or you disagree with it. And then you ask yourself why. So every why will have a general idea associated with it, and that is your evaluation. So when you're writing, you can incorporate as many of these as your text allows. Okay? So you may end up having more to add, and then you'll have to pick and choose what you think works best for the opinion that you're planning to share. Okay? Step number 4, you're developing your response as per the given question. Now, I would recommend that go through all of this first and then start writing. Spend 5 to 10 minutes with your question, with your text, with this planning process mentally, so that you're able to formulate a response that is within the word limit. Okay, you don't always have to ask questions. Now, someone just asked me if you have to ask questions within the evaluation process. With yourself, yes, ask yourself why or why not. Would you agree with this idea? But your text mein ye evaluated point doesn't have to be reflected as a question. It can be written as an opinion as well. For example, you can say that let's say animal testing is there's no negative marking for exceeding word limit, but yes, it is going to reduce your band level. Like it does reflect overall in your writing score. Okay, you don't have to state directly whether you agree with the concept or not. Okay, so basically the idea here is that once you've read your text, okay, and you've identified that this is point number 1, this is point number 2, this is point number 3 in favor, and then against. And you've also asked yourself which point of view I agree with. And that's going to be your third body paragraph, jahan pe apna opinion dena. Now, the idea here is, this is where the idea of discursive and argumentative writing plays a very important role, and whether you understand that or not. Now, once you've given your introduction, you've introduced your idea based on the format. Agar letter hai, to obviously uska different hoga, article hai, speech hai, sabka introduction fark hoga. But one common thing in all introductions is that you are going to introduce the idea that you are speaking of, okay? And the next thing is that you now begin your body paragraphs. Now, body paragraphs can be as many as your text requires. Now, the reason why I'm saying as many is because a lot of students believe that 3 body paragraphs hone chahiye, and that's it. एक में आपने positives की बात कर दी, एक में negative, and then तीसरे में opinion. Now, there are certain students that who prefer to counter argue. They write one positive and one negative, followed by the next positive and the next negative. Now, if you start doing that, the second strategy, which is the argumentative strategy, isme ye hota that you might end up with more paragraphs than 3, which is why I don't stick to a number for paragraphs. Okay? Regarding the paragraphs and discursive and argumentative writing, one thing you need to keep in mind is that your task at hand is to share both points of view. Okay? You need to write the pros as if they are all that matter. But at the same time, you need to write the cons as well. You need to avoid being biased to one side when you are presenting points of view. Because regardless of whether you agree that animal testing should be done or it should be banned, one thing you need to keep in mind is you still need to share information about both. Because that is when you'll be able to formulate an opinion that is justified. So no matter what I say about animal testing and animal rights, I cannot deny the fact that it is because animal testing exists that there are so many lives of people that we've saved. Now, I can't deny that, no matter what my opinion later on ends up being. So this is why you don't have to be completely defensive of one idea. Instead, you need to be bias-free. You need to mention all ideas that are involved within the text with transition, and then transition to your opinion. Okay? So basically, writing argumentatively depends on whether you choose to write with that counter argument, whereas writing discursively, you're basically trying to present both sides of the story. Discursive basically neutral hota hai. Discursive writing basically, okay, how to stay unbiased, we'll talk about that in just a second. And as far as the formats are concerned, if you just wait 5 minutes, we'll go over all formats for introduction and conclusion, opening kaise honi chahiye, ending kaise, we'll go over all of that. Okay? So don't worry about it, just give me 5 minutes. All right, so as far as the content is concerned, discursive basically ye hota hai ki you are neutrally highlighting both sides of the story. Okay? The argumentative style of writing is basically when you are counter-arguing. Whereas the persuasive style of writing is, which is something that comes in if they're asking you to persuade an individual of your opinion, where you're sharing your opinion and you're convincing them that this is the right way to go. All right. So, for example, if I am to write a report where I wish to convince, okay, there was actually a question in which they talked about ageism, where workplaces need to include all age groups. It shouldn't be limited to young people or old people, that a workplace should incorporate all age groups because they all have their own, you could say, benefits, and they all have something to add to the team. Now, there was a text that highlighted that there are organizations जो कहती हैं कि नहीं, young people are more useful for the team, where others say that experienced individuals bring more to the table as compared to young individuals who don't have experience at all. Now, the question stated that you need to write a speech for your employees highlighting how a mixed age group is the best strategy to run a company. Now, इसमें already उन्होंने state कर दिया था that you need to persuade your audience that it should be this way. So that is a persuasive writing through and through. You are persuading your audience that this is the best way forward. So that is when you're convincing the individuals. All right. So one thing that I want you all to keep in mind is that when we are focusing on the idea of, say, point of view versus point of view 1 versus 2. So इसमें आपका discursive ही होगा, followed by your persuasive opinion paragraph. However, अगर आप alternate करो तो वो argumentative होते हैं. So I hope I've answered that question. Yes, I'll be going over the formats as well. And someone just asked me about evaluation from text A written in second paragraph and third paragraph. Okay, so, okay. एक चीज प्लीज अपने आप को ये इस confusion से निकालें बाहर that text A and text B are different entities. They're not. Text A and text B are just references. They're just information. They're giving you information. You may actually come across one text. उसमें text A, text B ना हो, फिर what will you do then? So the idea of dividing paragraphs is about like ideas. एक point of view एक तरफ, दूसरा point of view दूसरी तरफ. So it's not that text A ही आना चाहिए second paragraph में या text B ही आना चाहिए third paragraph में. It's not about text A and text B. It's about points of view. It's about ideas. So keep in mind that you're not evaluating or you're not talking about text A and text B. You're talking about a point of view. You're talking about an idea or an opinion. All right. So you are basically clubbing together point of view one, not text A. So just clarify that. Okay. Okay. So I would suggest that do not waste space with rough planning. But this process does need to be done. So if you use a little bit of space and you do this, that's fine. But do go over these steps before you start writing. So there should be a little bit of a planning before you actually start writing, because if you don't evaluate, you don't identify, you'll actually end up coming up with your own points, or you'll end up, usually students they end up losing track of what the text was talking about in the first place. Okay? So yes, you should plan. This process is very important. If you don't plan, if you don't go over the question, you don't go over these steps, you're going to end up either writing more than you need to, or not enough, or completely off topic. तो ये तीन चीजें हैं जो बहुत commonly होती हैं if you do not plan your response before you start writing. Okay? Any more questions about this section before I move on? Okay, so how do we identify whether it is a discursive or an argumentative essay? All right, so the way to identify, basically, hoga discursive, you will be expected to highlight both sides of the argument. Argumentative writing basically it's a technique. Okay, it is not exactly a format. Argumentative writing होती है कि आप एक point of view देते हो and आप उसको counter करते हो. This is argumentative writing. So it's a way of writing more so as compared to a format. So argumentative writing technique जो है that you can use that in any question. You can choose to write that way. However, discursive, हर question discursive होगा. Because you will be expected to highlight both sides of the story, both points of view. And that's what discursive writing does. Discursive writing में आप state करते हो both sides of the story in a very unbiased way. And someone did ask me, how do we remain unbiased? We basically remain unbiased by not siding with one side of the story, doing justice to both. So we're not going to say this is better than that in our first line. My task at hand is to relay the information that I need to relay so that I can give my opinion later on, so that it's an informed opinion. No one questions my opinion after reading the points of view that I've shared already. Okay? Okay, so when you are persuading an individual, like for example, like in your opinion paragraph, if you are persuading them on a certain idea, then if you mention an opposing concept, that for example, the question that I shared about ages and talking about a mixed age group as a working team, usme, if I'm convincing them that mixed age groups hone chahiye. So talking about how one individual is going to bring something to the table and the other is going to bring something else. Technically, I am talking about opposing points of view. So I use them to convince the individual of what I'm trying to say. So अगर आप कोई opposition का point लाते हो उसके में अपने opinion paragraph में, while you're persuading, you need to counter it by saying, but this is why this opposing factor doesn't play a role. जैसे हमने animal testing की बात की थी. No matter how much we agree that it should be banned, we cannot deny that it has saved lives. So if I'm convincing them that it should still be banned, I may balance this by saying that there are alternative methods. So that opposing point will then be nullified. Okay, I've talked about discursive and argumentative. Achha, instead of writing all of the points out, you can just highlight them within the text. So don't waste your lined sheets on the planning process. You can just use the text to do that. Okay, so someone just asked this question about evaluation methods and whether they should include agreeing with one point or you can give a neutral view. Technically, you can't be neutral about any idea. Because if you agree, for example, there was a question in which the students were expected to write a letter talking about whether or not art is important in our life. Okay? So if I say that yes, art is important in some scenarios, technically I'm agreeing that art is important. Similarly, if I say that there are certain scenarios where art is not important, then I'm agreeing with that idea. So you can't remain neutral, because if you remain neutral, you will end up confusing yourself. So the argument will always be very balanced. So you'll realize that जब आप evaluate करते हो, you will end up being more inclined towards one idea as compared to the other. Writing neutrally is rather tricky, so it's not recommended. Someone just talked about utilizing a more sophisticated vocabulary. Yes, it's important to try and use the best vocabulary you've got, but that doesn't mean you use words that aren't appropriate for that particular point of view that you're trying to share. So the point here that says that you need to use vocabulary and sentence structures that are appropriate. Basically, sometimes a simple statement has more impact than a very elaborate descriptive one. Whereas sometimes we need to talk about something in a more detailed statement or a complex statement as compared to a simple one. There may be certain terms that better explain an idea as compared to others. So basically, the idea here is to use effective vocabulary. It's not about using big words that don't make sense. It's about using words that help your text portray an idea that it intends to portray. So when we talk about vocabulary, yes, we need to try and use sophisticated terms. We need to use terms that are appropriate for that scenario. So use the adjectives, use the transition words that text requires, that idea requires. All right. I've already talked about content points. You will be able to identify at least 10, if not more. Okay, I will be giving an overview of sample writing, so just hang in there. Yes, when you're evaluating, you can support any idea. So that's the thing, that's step 3. When you're evaluating points of view that you identify, you can go in favor of any of them. That's up to you. But then keep in mind that if this is something that you're agreeing with, do justice to that. Don't sound like you are not convinced of what you're agreeing with in the first place. Okay, so be very careful. If you're formulating an opinion, just stick to that. Okay, someone just said that you cannot write points outside the given passage. Technically, you will not need to, but that's where the evaluation process again comes in hand. When you read a text and you have identified one point, you ask yourself, do I agree with this? Do I disagree with this? Are there any more ideas that I can associate with this idea? And that is basically जो points आप लाते हो text में. So yes, you're using the text that you've been given, but at the same time, there will be content points that you may end up including as support to what you have already read in the text. So it will be based on that, but it will be probably on another tangent. For example, if I talk about how schools should incorporate outdoor learning, okay, how learning out in the open is beneficial for students. Now, if my article, for example, is focusing on whether or not schools should incorporate outdoor learning as part of the curriculum. Now, we can all agree that yes, if a child is given an open space and a physical environment to learn from, they will have physical examples in front of them to learn from, right? However, इससे एक मैं evaluate कर सकती हूँ point, or I can come up with the idea that if a student is doing very well in their gardening class, how does that play a role in his admission to a university? How is that quantified? So this may not be mentioned within the text, but the text did talk about learning in a garden. So I can question that by talking about how no matter how beneficial outdoor learning is, it is not quantifiable, which is why outdoor learning may not be the best approach to education at the point. Agar main ye opinion dena that I don't agree with outdoor learning, this can be a point that I can incorporate that comes from my understanding of the topic, wasn't mentioned within the text, but has been adapted from what the text says. So I hope that answers your question. I have talked about whether a text is discursive or argumentative. Writing argumentatively is a style. It's a counter argument, which is your choice. Okay, someone just said, when do we write in our own words? You always write in your own words. You have to avoid lifting chunks from the passage unless absolutely necessary, unless it's something that cannot be phrased in any other way. That's something else, which is not, something that they encourage either. But you do not copy from the text. So you have to keep in mind that your task at hand is to produce an original response. You're not copying from the text. You're adapting a response from the text. Okay, we will talk about effective punctuation. Summary writing we'll talk about before paper 1. The checking depends on the marking scheme provided. Okay, I think I've answered all the questions that we have so far. All right, so we can move on from this. Okay, so in order to make you understand what I've just talked about right now, what I'm going to do is, okay, this is a very important question. You cannot ask for extra paper in the exam. They already give you extra sheets in the booklet. So you technically don't get extra sheets. You won't need them. You shouldn't need them because there is only so much space you can need for 300 words. Okay, so keep in mind you're not getting extra sheets. This is something that everyone asks, and keep in mind you won't be given extra sheets. Okay, so I will go over a sample specimen paper since a lot of you have questions about what should be included in which paragraph. So let's go over that. Okay, so I'm going to do that. I'm going to go over the specimen paper for 2024, and usme I'll show you exactly what goes where. Balki, you know what? I'll go over the formats first, and based on that, I will highlight what goes where, and then we'll go over the specimen paper. Okay, so for example, you've been asked to write a letter. Okay, and based on the specimen paper, which is a question that highlights, beta narrative is composition, and we'll go over that right after directed writing is done. Okay, so for example, the specimen paper asks you to write an article. Okay, and in that article, you are basically focusing on the idea of whether it is beneficial for students to travel to other countries or not. Okay, so the first thing that I want you to do is I want you to look at the specimen paper. This is the specimen paper that you have in hand. Okay, we'll use this to go over all formats. So basically the idea here is that the specimen paper gives you this text A and text B, which is basically highlighting the idea of whether or not individuals should, students should travel to other countries or they should travel locally. Okay, so this is something that the text highlights. The first step, remember, we talked about reading the question, we talked about reading the text at hand. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the question. Okay, and I will talk about paragraphs through this text as well. So the question says that it's not necessary that there's always going to be two texts. एक भी हो सकता है, but दो भी हो सकते हैं. So it's up to them. They can probably give you a conversation between two people, and these two people are talking about opposing points of view. In that case, एक ही text होगा. But then in this case, since it's 2 points of view, उन्होंने text A or text B दिया है आपको. And the question basically says that you are writing a magazine article for young people about the advantages and disadvantages of traveling to other countries. In your article, you should, number 1, evaluate the ideas and opinions in both texts. And number 2, give your own views based on what you have read in the text that about the advantages and disadvantages of traveling to other countries. All right, so that's the question. They're talking about advantages and disadvantages of traveling to other countries. I'm going to ask all of you to take a minute and quickly skim through both texts. Text A is from a 42-year-old individual, whereas text B is from the perspective of a 23-year-old. Why is this important? I will ask you guys to tell me. All right. So we have these two conversations. They're very straightforward. They're focusing on two ideas. I want you to read it. Once you're done, you can raise your hands and then we can move forward. Okay, have you all skimmed through the text? A lot of you are asking how the information needs to be divided. So that's literally what I'm going to talk about right now. Okay, so for example, someone just identified the idea. Okay, so a lot of you are confused about how the information needs to be divided. Second paragraph and third paragraph. If you choose to write pros in the second paragraph and cons in the third paragraph or vice versa, that depends on what your opinion paragraph is supposed to say. For example, now this basically depends on every individual and every candidate has their own way of writing this. So for example, if you agree with the idea that now here we have advantages and disadvantages, right? We are being told that it's good to travel to other countries, whereas we're also being told of the disadvantages associated with traveling to other countries, right? So the first question that most of you have right now is, how do we know what information goes where? It doesn't matter if you write the pros first or cons first. There's no rule that says cons pehle aane chahiye or pros pehle aane chahiye. It all depends on whether your overall text has a flow to it or not. For example, once we've read both of these ideas, we have established that yes, traveling to other countries is going to be beneficial for us, but at the same time, there are certain disadvantages that we cannot deny, right? Now, my opinion is that, now this is just an example. You can disagree with my opinion. So if my opinion is that students, young students, should travel to other countries, and the reason why I believe this is something very important is because of the experience that it offers. Now, if this is the opinion that I'm going to conclude my text with, my article is going to give the opinion that it is more important to travel to other countries as compared to your own. Now, a better flow might be that I talk about the cons first, and then I talk about the pros, and then follow it by my positive opinion. Whereas I can contrast both ideas as well, saying that this is one side of the story, while others believe that traveling to other countries is not as beneficial or advantageous as they wish for it to be. Give those reasons. However, a strong opinion, or I hold the opinion and I give my opinion. Now, it doesn't matter आपने second paragraph में pros लिखे या cons लिखे. What matters is if your ideas flow in a coherent format or not. So I hope that answers your question. Okay, so someone just said that your opening could be, according to some senior citizen, traveling is not preferable. Acha, they're not talking. Now, this is something that I want to point out very clearly right now. And this is something a lot of students don't even realize that they've made this mistake. We're not asking for a response on traveling only. The question says advantages and disadvantages of traveling to other countries. So we're not talking about traveling, because traveling, you are traveling from your school to your house as well, in a way. So the question is not talking about traveling, it's talking about the advantages and disadvantages of traveling to other countries. You'll notice that text A में भी वो कह रही है that you should travel, but you shouldn't travel to other countries as a priority. You should first travel within your own country. That's what the first text says. So keep in mind, you are not talking about traveling. You're talking about traveling to other countries. This clarity needs to be there. All right, let's talk about the formulation of the response itself. Okay, once everyone has read the question, once everyone has gone over the content that we have at hand, the next step that we need to keep in mind is that how do we evaluate this, right? That's the next question that everyone ends up having. So once you've read your text, we will basically be identifying the information that needs to be divided. Since this is an article, I'll start off with the article format, and then I'll talk about the other formats as well. So basically, you can ask rhetorical questions, by the way. It makes actually a very interesting opening to your article. For example, in this case, if we are talking about, say, traveling to other countries. Now, my article obviously is going to require a heading. You may be given a heading within the question. If you're not given a heading, you may give it yourself. So, but you have to, it's part of the format. So you give an appropriate heading followed by a byline. A byline is basically where you mention the name of the author in this case. Okay, so basically the idea here is once you've given your article an appropriate heading, the next thing is to add your byline. Someone asked me about punctuation. So one thing that I would like to bring forward, no, you are the author, you're the writer, basically. It's by you, so you write your name. The next thing that we need to keep in mind, since someone already asked me about punctuation, one thing you need to keep in mind is that your text needs to be indented a certain way. So the block format works best in terms of how the CIE prefers their responses. So that means you leave a line between every paragraph. So that's indentation. Okay, so you divide your paragraphs by leaving a line. Secondly, the use of punctuation. Effective punctuation is when you use question marks where required, you give short pauses by using a comma, whereas you end your statement by using a full stop. So commas are basically used to build a pause between either a complex sentence or if you have a very long run-on sentence, you divide that information by including commas. Okay, so I hope that answered your question. The first thing that we need to keep in mind is once we have the heading and byline out of the way, the next thing is our introduction. This is where we clearly identify what the topic is. We mention what we're talking about, and we have to keep in mind that our article is something that is meant for a particular audience. Remember when we talked about the TAP method and said that we need to identify the text, and we also need to identify the purpose and audience. This basically means if I'm writing an article, for example, that means my audience is the general public. And in this case, young individuals. So I will keep this in mind because if I am not writing for one particular person and instead I'm writing for a larger group, that means I need to incorporate ideas that will cater to all of these individuals. But the question says we're writing to young people. So I need to make sure that my content does not talk about ideas that makes these young people question the article altogether. For example, I would request you guys to stop annotating the screen. So if we are basically writing an article, say, for a newspaper as compared to a magazine article, for example. So a magazine article is going to have a very specific audience, which is going to be, in this case, young people. However, if I am writing an article for a newspaper, fark dono mein ye hota hai that when you are writing an article for a newspaper, your audience is much more, you could say, general as compared to a magazine article. All right, a magazine article is not going to talk about something that is very generic. It's going to be very specific to that particular audience. Whereas when I talk about the idea of, say, writing a newspaper article, usme I can incorporate general concepts. I may even need to incorporate ideas such as the definitions of certain ideas, or just a second. So if we are writing an article for a magazine, we'll be very specific to my audience, which is young people. If it's a newspaper article, I will have to keep in mind that there will be individuals in my audience who may not know what I'm talking about, and I may need to define certain ideas, and I may need to avoid using terms that may not be very generally known. So this is one major difference that we have in terms of how a magazine article is different from a newspaper article. However, the format is the same. So the format remains the same. My overall tone will change. The way I formulate my content, that will change based on my audience. Article format remains the same. All right. So we initially have an introduction where we are introducing what we're talking about. So someone just mentioned rhetorical questions. Now, I would actually recommend using rhetorical questions as your opening. So for example, if I am writing, say, an article on traveling, maybe I would want to start with a what if scenario or a rhetorical question asking them something like, say, would you, imagine, or maybe an imagine scenario as well. So anything that you think will catch the reader's attention can be incorporated in the introduction. Yes, we have to keep it concise. Do not write more than you need to for your introduction, but you should keep it interesting and catchy by incorporating these ideas. For example, you can use rhetorical questions, you can have imagine scenarios, what if scenarios, you can question the audience so that, your article that follows in a way answers that question. Number one. Secondly, that we incorporate within our introduction is the idea of what the topic is going to be about. So for example, in this case, since we're talking about traveling to other countries, I will highlight the idea that the article talks about, which is highlighting how there are many individuals out there, many young individuals out there who are battling the question whether to travel locally or internationally. Now, if I just incorporate this one statement in my introduction, any reader will know that my article is about international travel versus local travel. So that's going to be my introduction, followed by the body paragraphs, which will incorporate the content that I have highlighted from the text. I will talk about why it is important to travel internationally in one side of the story. Second, I will talk about all those ideas that I evaluate from the text. Okay. Once we've gone over the format, we will go over the specific points for this article as well. So I will incorporate all points of view together. I will evaluate any ideas that I may associate with it. And then I will move on to the next point of view. So once I have highlighted all of my points of view, the third paragraph, or the fourth in case if you are dividing it further, is going to be for your own opinion as well, because that's what the question asks. The question is asking you whether or not it is more advantageous to travel to other countries or disadvantages. So aapka jo bhi opinion hoga, you will support it with reasons why. One common mistakes that students make is that they do not, someone just asked me to repeat. Can you ask, what do you need me to repeat? The format? So one mistake the students do end up making is the idea that when they're writing their own opinion, they just say that I hold the opinion, or they say that my opinion is this, and then they don't support it with any reasons or any facts or figures or anything to actually support why this opinion stands. So basically, the idea here is to talk about, fine, you agree with the idea that international travel is better. Give reasons, convince the audience. You can talk to them about how international travel is important for them, or it may be the better choice right now for these young individuals, because my audience is young people, because this is their age to travel. So maybe that is a reason I can give to talk about how traveling to other countries is going to be beneficial for them, or is something that is going to hold quite an advantage for these young people, because this is their age to travel, or because this is when they are going to be more open-minded to cultures. text में, I'm sure you remember, they talked about how you travel abroad to experience cultures. So one evaluated point from that could be talking about how young individuals are more perceptive to cultures as older people. So a 30-year-old or a 40-year-old may not be able to enjoy a culture the same way a 25-year-old might, or a 23-year-old might, right? So it's going to be a very different experience. So who you are in your life at that stage is obviously going to play a very important role in the way you experience something. Similarly, if I don't agree with the idea of international travel and I say that, it is something that is not recommended for these individuals, these young individuals, I could support my idea by saying how they are not financially independent at this point. And they are not very conscious of who they are as individuals. So it's better for them to know their own self and their own culture before they experience others so that they have something to compare it with. So these are evaluated ideas that I can incorporate in my opinion paragraph. All right. So that being said, okay, talking about negative effects of culture, yes, you can, but you do need to then highlight what you mean by negative effects. So, for example, I would rephrase your point by saying, I won't say that experiencing different cultures may have a negative effect on you. I could say that young individuals are very impressionable. And so it's very important for them to have a strong understanding of who they are and what their culture is before they experience other cultures that can influence them. So I'm not sounding very negative towards other cultures. Instead, I am just giving the audience a point of view why your own culture is better. So do you see how we need to keep our tone very formal and we need to keep our tone as respectful as possible? So that's why I'm not going to say other cultures are bad. Instead, I will just say that these individuals are impressionable. But you can type in any questions that you have in the chat. All right. Okay. So I hope that answers your question. Yes, you will use the text to give reasons. So you can use the text to come up with reasons why you agree with something or you disagree with something. I think a better way to understand this would be if I just quickly go over the specimen paper and let's evaluate points together. I think that would make this easier.
दोनों आइडिया वो कर सकते हैं.
All right. I would actually ask students to use language that they are comfortable with. Do not try to use words that you don't know the meanings of. Okay, so that's one big suggestion that I would give you. Do not try to impress the examiner by using words that you do not even understand. So yes, using words that highlight a certain idea, yes, they're important. But you need to keep in mind that you use vocabulary effectively. So do not use words that you do not even know the meaning of. Okay, that being said, now in front of us, we have our text, right? So let's look at text A first. I'm going to try and identify one point that I believe talks about the idea of how international travel may not be the best way to, learn and experience. Okay. So for example, either इन्होंने ये point बात की that it is going to be a very it's the biggest disadvantage that this person is trying to highlight is the idea of how traveling internationally has a negative impact on the environment. Okay, so I can evaluate this, or I can further question this idea by talking about how international travel, yes, it has a negative impact on the environment, but that is something that applies to all forms of travel, doesn't it? So you can actually include an alternative by talking about how why not choose eco-friendly ways to travel, but at the same time prioritize the idea of you guys have permission to unmute. You can unmute yourself. So you can actually incorporate the idea that yes, it is not eco-friendly. So perhaps searching for better alternatives is the way forward. Okay. Similarly, if I look at another idea where over here it says that it opens the eyes of individuals, young people will be able to learn. This broadens their understanding of the world that they live in. It is basically teaching them something about the world around them. Okay. So what I can talk about in this respect is going to be how if an individual is traveling to learn, then one thing that needs to be incorporated here as well is the idea of how learning where you come from is also important. So that is what evaluation is all about. So you identify a point and then you ask yourself, how do I agree with this? Are there any ideas I can associate with this idea? If they're saying traveling internationally is educational, then we need to keep in mind that local travel is also educational. So if I am defending international travel, how do I say that it is more beneficial, more educational? Okay, so these are basically ideas that we associate with the given text. I am actually going to show you the marking scheme as well, where all the points that I've just mentioned have already been highlighted. And you will see that the text basically has ample arguments for both sides of the story. So they are talking about the idea of how international travel is something that is negative as well as positive. So text one says, number one, that a lot of people choose international travel and because of that, they're unable to get to know their own country. Evaluation process for this question could be talking about whether or not international travel actually makes people neglect their own country or not. What if international travel makes me appreciate my own country more? So if I evaluate this point in favor of international travel, I will say that local travel is something that will be encouraged when people see the world and they learn to appreciate what they have more. Next, they talk about the environment, how the environment is being affected negatively because of international travel. We can evaluate this by talking about how number one, local travel is also not environmentally friendly. So we can probably try and find better ways to travel instead of simply saying that travel is not eco-friendly. Third point that they talk about is how there are so many tourist attractions that end up costing individuals more than they should. So when I evaluate this point, I can question, number one, yes, international travel is getting more and more expensive because it is very, very common or encouraged. So I'm not going to say common, I'm going to say a lot of people are interested in international travel because of which it becomes expensive. So if more and more people travel internationally, overall the cost will go down. That's one way of evaluating this point. But the opposing point that I can take out from this is going to be how international travel is expensive because people aren't traveling. So either ways, I can use the same point to support one idea that I choose to, with whatever I agree with. Next, we talk about the idea of how it helps us to understand our own culture more. So basically, understanding our old culture is more important according to individual in text A. So keeping in mind that international travel will also help us do that. Culture is important no matter where it's from. So if it's your culture or someone else's, it is important to know the culture. It is important for us to know where we come from and what we have around us, right? So both ideas will play a very important role in that. Next, talking about the idea of traveling locally in order to spend more time with family and friends. So this is something that we can talk about in terms of how traveling with family and friends can also be something that can incorporate a good understanding of the text. Now, this was just text 1. We will also incorporate text 2. Obviously, our next paragraph will be the next opinion, where we highlight the idea of how it is human nature to want to see things. So when it is human nature to want to see things, we shouldn't limit it to the idea of simply highlighting international travel. Why not see your own country as well? That's something that we can evaluate from this point. Travel is educational and offers many opportunities. So again, applies to local and international travel. So we will use this point to support either opinion that we may have. Next, travel can be life-changing. So one thing that we cannot deny is, yes, traveling internationally, incorporating other cultures as part of our life for that short period of time will help individuals learn about that culture, appreciate their own culture. And there are certain experiences that you cannot replace by just knowing about them or experiencing something similar. Instead, you need to be there to know what it's like, right? So that is something that we can use as a point to support the idea of how traveling internationally is very beneficial. Next, talking about making friends. Now, meeting friends from other cultures helps us realize the world is smaller than we think. Now, this is something that we can use in the opposing argument as well. So basically, if I say that I get to meet a lot of people if I travel internationally, I can say local travel does that for me as well. If I go to local tourist attractions, I will get to meet individuals from different cultures, but at the same time, I will be able to experience my own cultures. It's like 2 for 1, right? So if experiencing cultures and meeting new people is the goal, then why not travel locally to tourist attractions to do so? However, I can counter that idea by saying that I do not know what a culture is like if I do not experience it, right? So you have to be there to experience it. Next, the last thing that they say, travel can make people less focused on material possessions. Now, this is one very interesting point that they have talked about. If I say that it makes you appreciate what you have, the resources you have, all of those things, what about the fact that you are spending a lot of finances to travel? So isn't it making you more materialistic in a way? Because if you choose to spend a lot of money for an experience that you might be able to experience for a lot less if you travel locally. So this point goes both ways. This is how they have evaluated it. This point right here, whether we need to travel to understand different cultures in the age of the internet. So there is so much information out there that I can access because of technology. So do I need to be there for all of these experiences? That's one thing that we can definitely take out of this point. And talking about how travel itself is a materialistic idea. So how can we defend the fact that this is making us less materialistic? So this is basically what evaluation is. For those who were still confused, the points that we looked at first, those were the points that were identified. These are the evaluated points. These are questions that you can ask. Do notice that it says possible evaluation ideas. So if there's anything that you can come up with outside these 4 points is supported by the text, you're good to go. It doesn't have to be these 4. So anything that you can associate with the text that you already read, that is your evaluation process. And if you reflect these ideas within the text, when you write your article or letter or speech, then you will basically be effectively evaluating. All right. Before I move on, yes, any questions for what I've talked about so far?
Miss, when we're evaluating, do we have to mention the opposition points and then evaluate those points and just give our proposition opinion at the end? Or do we have to mention opposition and proposition throughout in order with signposting?
Okay, so basically what I would say here is that number one, if you are talking about, say, a point in favor, right? If I say, for example, once I have given my introduction, and I am talking about in the first paragraph, the first body paragraph, I'm talking about all the advantages of local travel. Or let's say, okay, first of all, I'd like to ask you, what's your opinion? Do you think it is an advantage to travel to other countries or a disadvantage?
A disadvantage. But
You
since
think
this
it's a
is for like
disadvantage?
people in like a newspaper journal for people of our age, so it should be like for a local travel.
So that's the thing. I wanted to answer keeping in mind the question. If I ask this question in an audience that has a vast age group, then they will have different views. But if I'm asking all individuals like you guys, young people, most of you would agree that traveling internationally is something that we believe is beneficial for us, right? Because as young individuals, we want to experience more. Okay.
Ma'am,
So once
can
you,
I ask
yeah.
something?
Beta,
I
can I
want to
answer
say,
your question and then I'll take your question, okay?
yeah, sure, sorry to interrupt.
Give me 1 second. All right. So basically, when you're talking about the argument and how the evaluation goes for each side of the story, once you've given your introduction and now you're transitioning to the point of view that there are a lot of advantages of traveling to other countries, right? So, for example, that's what I choose to talk about first. For example, if I talk about how it is human nature to want to see things, that's the first point I identified. Now, when I'm evaluating this idea, I will talk about how it is inherently very human to want to experience new things. Now, this is my twist to the statement that the text already stated, that we want to see new things. So I'll say that it is very inherent within humans, or it is very human to want to experience the world around us. Okay? Once I've said this, this is my reflection of the text. My evaluation of this would be talking about how this is going to be an experience, or this, or okay, I would actually say following through with this inherent need is not only going to be beneficial for us as humans, but as young individuals who are in the process of learning about life as we know it. So I've talked about education, I've talked about it being human, and at the same time, I have combined these two ideas as something that young individuals seek right now because they're learning. So isme I have done three things. I've mentioned two content points and I've evaluated my own understanding of them. Does that make sense to you? Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. So while I mentioned that idea of how it is very human to want to experience something, my evaluation was to understand that these are young individuals who are very eager to learn and explore. Because education की बात की थी ना उन्होंने. So my understanding of education is how young people are very eager to, experience things, new things. So I incorporate that within. So it will be possible for you to combine ideas and evaluate them together as well. If I've not answered your question, you can let me know and then I can evaluate further.
Miss, if I'm of the opinion that they should stay in between, that they should visit places internationally, and then they should also like explore local tourist spots. So how do I evaluate that idea?
Okay. So basically the idea, if any of you think that you hold a very neutral opinion in this case, it would actually be easier for you to evaluate this if you actually ask yourself, what's more important? What should they do first? Do you think young individuals should travel locally first and then go abroad to experience other cultures, or they should experience other cultures and then come back to their own culture? So you will not be able to write neutrally without saying one is better than the other. So it would actually be better for you to decide what's a priority then. So if you think that a question is making you think very neutrally, then a better way to evaluate that would be to ask yourself, what is more important? What do I need to do first? Okay. So once you've answered that question, go with that line of thought. Because if you don't do that, you will actually end up contradicting yourself. Because if I say that I need to travel internationally because it's the experience of a lifetime, and then in the next line I say I need to travel locally so that I know where I come from, I'm contradicting my own ideas. So don't do that, because it's very difficult to remain neutral without contradicting whatever you're saying. So instead, ask yourself, what's more important? What do I want to do first? So in this case, would you recommend that young individual, for example, you're writing this article for your younger sister or brother, would you recommend that they travel locally first and then go abroad, or go abroad and then travel locally? So think about it on those lines. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah? All right. So try not to be too neutral because it won't be possible because there are arguments and they are opposing one another. So ask yourself what's more important. Okay, so someone else had a question?
Yeah, so I was saying that what if we actually as there are two texts which are like evaluating different points of view. So
Mhm.
अगर मैं introduction दे दूँ पहले and then I continue with the paragraph 1 with the drawbacks and the paragraph 3 with the benefits. और जो evaluation वाला जो conclusion वाला paragraph होगा उसमें मैं अपना वो बताऊँ अपना point of view. So it would be like understandable like in the last paragraph when I'm concluding okay, whether it is an advantage or a disadvantage.
Okay, so basically, when we are dividing our information, one thing I want you all to understand is the conclusion is not your opinion paragraph. The conclusion is kind of like a ribbon that you put on a present. Okay, so the conclusion wraps up. जैसे हम introduction generically देते हैं, वैसे ही हम एक conclusion भी देते हैं to wrap up what we're writing in all forms of writing. So keep in mind that the body paragraphs will be 3 at least, can be more. Second body paragraph may one point of view, one side of the argument. Second body paragraph may have the second point of the argument. Third body paragraph may have अपना opinion दिया with supporting reasons why you believe this is the case. Because I've already talked about all of the advantages of international travel and the disadvantages. And then इसके बाद अगर तीसरे paragraph में क्या I hold the opinion of how the advantages outweigh the disadvantages. Now I need to give reasons why now. I need to tell them, I need to tell my audience why the disadvantages which are true are not going to outweigh the benefits. You need to remember when you're writing an article, you are the one who mentioned those disadvantages. So you basically need to convince your audience that yes, these disadvantages exist, but this advantage or these advantages are more significant as compared to these disadvantages. This is what you're trying to achieve in your opinion paragraph.
So how will I defend the statement that this is like fuel guzzling airplanes where like they're consuming a lot of fuel, like burning of fossil fuels. So I'm
you
gonna
can,
defend
okay,
that
so the
point.
statement that you would say is that one cannot deny the fact that any form of travel is going to have an impact on the environment.
Okay.
So in order to protect that human need to explore, why not research, look for ways in which one can travel in an eco-friendly manner, yet at the same time getting to experience those cultures and learning about the world around us. So I am defending the fact that it is so important for me to travel that instead of saying, okay, I'm going to leave a negative carbon footprint, I'm not going to travel. Instead of saying that, I'll say that since it's important to travel locally or internationally, whatever your point of view is, why not look for eco-friendly ways? Similarly, I have to say there's a point of how it is financially draining. One cannot deny that traveling internationally is very expensive. So a lot of Europeans have come up with the solution that they go backpacking instead. So instead of spending a lot of money on the travel itself, they use the money that they have for the experience. They don't mind staying in smaller motels or even hostels. So these are alternatives that people have come up with to counter that disadvantage. So अपने opinion को आप convince करने के लिए you can come up with ideas like that. Does that make sense? Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay. Anyone else who wants me to go over this particular question before I move on to other formats?
Ma'am, one question.
Yes, Rayan.
As you told that in the third paragraph, third body paragraph, we have to give our own opinion. So in that, when we're giving our own opinion, we should give our own ideas, or we should leave some points from the text and then include them in this opinion paragraph to support our opinion. Please clear this.
Okay, so yes, you will be incorporating ideas from the text for your opinion paragraph. Basically, your opinion is formulated on what you read. Your opinion is for what you have read in the text. So, for example, what is your opinion on the matter? Do you think international travel is advantages or disadvantages?
Advantage.
Okay, so you are in favor of how young individuals should travel to other countries. Can you give me a reason why?
Because they get a chance to explore new cultures, and the main point I'd support by that is education, totally education.
Okay, so since we've already talked about the educational aspect of international travel, and we've talked about, because हमने जब advantages पहले highlight किए थे तो हमने ये बात कर ली है that it is advantageous because it is an educational experience, right? We've already talked about this. So in your opinion paragraph, what you're going to do is, when you're incorporating this idea again, what you're going to do is you will highlight the idea that as young individuals, our need, because you are talking to young individuals and you are a young individual writing this. So you say our need to explore cannot be quenched with small experiences. And in this day and age, one needs to physically experience certain cultures and certain phenomena of the world, because obviously have natural sunsets and all of those. So they need to physically experience them to be able to truly understand their value in our life. So I could use a statement like that to support that idea. So in your opinion paragraph, yes, I will use the education opinion, the idea of education from the text. But when I elaborate it, I will do that with my own understanding of what education means to me. I will not just talk about it the way the text talks about it, that they're learning something. I will talk about how it is an experience that they will be able to keep with them for the rest of their life. So in a way, it's an asset for them as well, just the way all learning experiences are.
Okay, ma'am, understood.
Does that, yeah? All right. Any more questions before I move on to other formats?
Can we also talk about globalization and understanding new cultures and learning new languages abroad? Can we include and incorporate that?
So when you are incorporating the idea of globalization is something that you evaluated from experiencing different cultures, right?
Mm-hmm.
For those who still didn't understand evaluation, this is a good point. The text said we travel to experience new cultures. So we can evaluate an idea out of this, talking about how we live in a world that is moving very quickly towards globalization. Because of technology, the borders that we have around us are virtually disappearing, right? So to be able to experience these cultures, this global community physically is definitely an experience that's going to अब इसमें आप ये इसको support करने के लिए ये आप include कर सकते हो that since we are moving to a global age, physically experiencing these cultures, meeting these people will actually play a part in how we respond to the world around us in the future. So you can incorporate the idea that it's going to, as a young individual, this will prepare me for the future. Because then I will be more perceptive to working with different kinds of people or being around different kinds of people. Okay, so that idea of global, because again, keeping in mind, we're writing to young individuals. These people will be, taking part in the workforce later on. They'll be working in an office. Maybe they'll have people from different cultures there. So if I'm a well-traveled individual, I will have that ability to work with these people because I've already had an opportunity to experience what it's like to be in a different culture. So does that make sense?
It does. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so that's how basically you can take your evaluated point and further enhance on it based on what the text says. Any more questions?
Yes.
Go ahead.
So, when we write an article, we should stick to one opinion of the topic, and then when we start to evaluate our opinion, uh, when writing the advantages, such as writing about the advantages of traveling locally, if I have the opinion of traveling abroad, should I evaluate against uh, uh, traveling locally when evaluating its points?
Okay, if this is if this is your second paragraph, then yes. Basically, okay. Let me just show you the format and I'll tell you exactly what you are asking. Just a second. So basically what you're asking me, जब आप एक point को evaluate कर रहे हो, तो obviously one thing that I want you all to keep in mind is, I don't want you should not get confused with what you're going to talk about later. Okay? So just a second, let me show you the format. All right, this is the article format, right? For example, once I've given my introduction, over here I've talked about all of those disadvantages that are associated with the idea of traveling internationally, from finances to the environment to all of those ideas that we identified in the first place जब हमने text 1 को read किया था. ठीक है? Once I've done that, and I have evaluated ideas that I associate with that as well, इधर आके I will say, on the other hand, one cannot deny. अब क्योंकि मैं positive सी बात कर रही हूँ, I will say that on the other hand, one cannot deny that traveling to other countries holds the benefit of catering to that human need to experience new cultures. और इसको और generic करना है तो catering to that human need to experience the world around us. ठीक है? फिर इधर I will stick to my advantages then. Okay, so I'm not going to confuse it by what I've said. I am not trying to say this. I'm basically trying to, if you're visually imagining this article, in one paragraph, you're saying this is one side of the story. However, on the other hand, this is also an opinion that is associated with traveling to other countries. However, I hold the opinion that this is more significant as compared to this. Does that make sense? So you don't have to confuse the ideas, because regardless of whether you agree or disagree, the opinions that have been shared as advantages in the text or disadvantages, they hold their ground. They are true. And आपने उनको लिखना है यहाँ. So over here, once you've highlighted one side of the story, you say, on the other hand, one cannot deny, and then you write that side of the story. However, the advantages far outweigh the disadvantages when a young individual is considering whether or not to travel to other countries. And then I give reasons why they outweigh it. Does that answer your question? Hashir? All right. Any more questions? Okay, we have a few questions in the chat as well. Yes, you can reflect your own understanding of points within the body paragraphs. So you definitely can do that. Okay, talking about formats now, since that is something that a lot of students are confused about, and rightly so. We talked about the article format. I'm going to quickly go over the remaining formats. The first one being that of a letter, because this is the simplest. Now, letters and emails follow the same format in a way. Just keep in mind that when you are formulating your response for a letter or an email, keep in mind that you are not required to write any addresses or subject lines or anything like that anymore. You directly start off with the idea of dear sir, ma'am, or uncle if it's an informal letter. Based on whoever your individual is, you write your greeting. Now, one thing that I would like to point out, obviously, in this case, is the idea that when we are writing a letter, this is a response to one particular person. I'm not writing my letter to a group of people anymore. So, the article speech report, article and speech hoti, that is for a vast audience. लेकिन जो report or letter होता है या email होता है, that's for one person. Why does it matter that it's for one person? Because if I am writing to one person, I need to keep in mind that this is the only individual I'm catering. So I don't need to be very general with my information. I am directly corresponding with this particular individual. So keep in mind that whenever you are writing a letter or a report, it is directed to one individual. You are talking to one person. All right. That being said, once you have written your greeting, your introduction is going to state the purpose of your letter. For example, I'm writing this letter, or one line that you can definitely incorporate is that I hope this letter finds you in the best of health. Now, this is something that you can actually write for formal letters as well. It's not discouraged you can wish them well. Yes, we will keep our tone extremely formal if it's a formal letter. For example, if you're writing a letter to your teacher or your principal or an editor from a newspaper, or you're responding to a letter that you received from a company or anything like that. If it's formal, we'll stick to our formal tone. If it's an informal letter, we can definitely incorporate a little bit of a scenario corresponding to that letter and that particular person. Okay, so आपका जो opening होगा for a letter, I hope this letter finds you in the best of health. I'm writing this letter in reference to an article I read in the newspaper, or some information I'd like to share with you on a matter, whatever the question says. Okay? Once you have written your introduction and introduced what your letter is going to be about, you move on to your body paragraphs. Now, just the way we divided information for our article, letter में भी हम अपनी information को divide कर सकते हैं. Okay? So before I actually go over the format, I'm just going to show you a question for a letter so that you understand exactly what we're writing for. Okay? So for example, ये जो हमने question अभी देखा था, इसमें the letter that we're writing is for the head teacher explaining why you would or would not want to see artificial intelligence in your school. Okay? So the reason why I'm referring to this question is because I'll specifically give you ways to divide this information in a letter now. Okay? So for example, my text was highlighting the idea of how artificial intelligence has benefits when incorporated into a classroom and has drawbacks when incorporated into a classroom. So I'll start my letter by saying, I hope this letter finds you in the best of health. I'm writing this letter in order to, or as a concerned parent, I'm writing this letter to share my views and understanding of artificial intelligence in the classroom and the opinions I hold on the matter. Okay? For example, in my introduction ho gaya. First body paragraph. Firstly, use of transition words in letters and other forms of writing is highly encouraged. Please use transition words. इससे होगा ये कि आपके जो points of view हैं, you will be able to highlight them much more clearly. You will be clear with what you're trying to say. Okay? So firstly, artificial intelligence is seen as a benefit or a very useful resource in the classroom because I'll give those reasons. Whatever I evaluate, I will incorporate that there as well. Okay? First body paragraph में अगर मैंने सारे firstly, secondly, thirdly सारे वो points of view mention कर दिए that are in favor of artificial intelligence in the classroom. Second body paragraph में I incorporate by saying, on the other hand, many parents or many adults or many individuals hold the opinion that artificial intelligence may not have the benefits we all wish to believe that they do, that it does. And then I incorporate all of those ideas that the text highlighted. And then I also talk about how those disadvantages are significant. For example, अगर मैंने पहले text में ये बात की है that artificial intelligence is going to make the learning experience very convenient or very quick for the students. On the counter view, I can mention the idea that, however, we cannot deny that artificial intelligence is also crippling the students because it is making them stop thinking. They are not thinking anymore. They are losing their ability to analyze ideas, to think on their own. Someone just mentioned how students use artificial intelligence to cheat or complete their homework. So yes, a lot of times, because you're using artificial intelligence to produce a response, you are actually not learning anything from that process. So if I use AI to generate a response, I am not learning anything because I did not write that response myself. Okay? But that does not mean that I saved time. I did not save time. That benefit still holds. I still saved time. If I don't have time and I have to complete an assignment and there is no other way for me to, benefit from this situation, what can I do? I will probably use AI because I don't have the time to spend on that assignment in that moment. So the ability to save time versus the loss of ability of critical reasoning or critical thinking. Now, these are both contrasting views. First body paragraph, I highlighted all of the points I associate with the idea of why artificial intelligence has advantages. Second May, I incorporated the ideas that I evaluated and identified from the text, highlighting why artificial intelligence may not be the best approach in an education system. However, as a parent, now I'm talking about the third body paragraph. इसमें I am going to talk about the idea of what I believe as a parent or as a student in this scenario. Okay? Yes, a lot of schools and colleges do allow artificial intelligence and responses generated from AI in order to save time. So I cannot deny the fact that there are certain scenarios where I can use artificial intelligence in order to save time and at the same time pull out information that will be beneficial for my learning process. Okay? So that again depends on what opinion you hold. Someone just mentioned talking about how it leads to unemployment for teachers. So if I was writing from the perspective of a teacher, I would definitely say AI is not something that I would encourage in the school because it is denying students that human interaction. Okay, so until and unless you input that particular keyword, you will not have that response. However, a discussion between two humans leads to a more learning, more natural learning experience. So these are points that I can evaluate based on what I've read from the text. So third paragraph, I will definitely include my opinion as that one individual. For example, if I'm a student who wishes to see artificial intelligence, I'll convince my head teacher that as a student, I believe that artificial intelligence will make my learning process, along with the learning process of other students, more worthy of the 21st century. And then I'll give reasons why I believe so. Similarly, if I go against the idea, I'll give reasons why I believe that is not the case. I can also incorporate ideas of how, if I believe that it should be incorporated in schools, I can say that it's going to make the learning process more interesting for students and easier for the parents and teachers, because with the incorporation of technology, their job is made easier as well. So everyone's happy at the end of the day. So yes, you can incorporate the idea of how it's not just impacting you as a student, parent, or teacher, but the other members of that community as well. Because when we're talking about a school, obviously we have teachers, students, administration, parents, all of these individuals are part of that one organization, one community. So if I am saying that AI is beneficial in a school, I can use this idea that it's going to not only benefit me, but those around me as well. Or it's not only a disadvantage for me, but those around me as well. So that's what's going to make my letter more convincing. If I am writing to this individual and I cater to all of those around me, the community within that school, then my letter becomes more convincing. Acha. Talking about how excessive use of AI can lead to less creativity and hence AI is easily going to take over. Okay, so yes, it is going to impact greatly on the way students think, right? So if all students end up using AI for their responses will not have that essence of individuality in them anymore. So definitely it's going to take over the way they think as well. Okay, so all of these points that your students are coming up with, yes, they're all valid, but keep in mind only to incorporate these if they are supported by the text. Okay, so as per the new format, all of these ideas जो हमने in 3 body paragraphs में include करने, they have to be based on what we read in the text. So it has to be along those lines. So just keep that in mind. No, this is not our conclusion. This is our closing. So once I have mentioned my opinion, I would say that in the last paragraph, I'm going to politely thank this individual for taking out the time to read my letter. I will reflect on saying that I look forward to a response on the matter, and I hope that the information and opinions that I shared in reference to artificial intelligence as part of the learning experience for students in our school helps you make a decision that is beneficial for all members of this community, students, parents, and teachers alike. Now, why did I say this statement? Because you should always wrap up with reinstating what your question was actually about. So, when I'm thanking them, I'm also thanking them. This is what I talked about. So I hope this was useful for you. Once I've said that, I close by saying best regards and sign off with your full name. Any questions about the letter format? Any questions? Ideas of our own along the ideas from the text? Yes, you can. जो ideas and evaluation की हमने पहले बात की है, talking about how yes, you can incorporate ideas you based off of idea. That applies to all directed writing formats. चाहे वो letter हो, article हो, speech हो, report हो. You can. I think we'll be done with directed writing in another 10 minutes, and then we will go over narrative and descriptive essays as well. ठीक है? So आपका जो ये third body paragraph है, this is going to be for your opinion and supporting arguments, followed by thanking the individual. ये आपका last paragraph है technically, where you thank the individual for taking out the time to read your letter and hope for a response if that's what the question gives room for. Beta, आप letter की closing, this is your last paragraph in terms of conclusion. This is your closing. This is not your conclusion. This is technically your conclusion. लेकिन आप जब letter end करते हो तो obviously you thank the individual, right? So that's your closing. Yes, someone is mentioning that do we include the perspectives of 2 or more people, teachers, students, etc. Depends on the question. If the question is asking to write from the perspective of a student, you will have to stick to that. However, to support your opinion, you can say that it is not only helping me as a student, but also the rest of the community that includes parents, teachers, and the administration. So it depends on the question. Okay, so keep in mind the question and then decide on what your point of view should be. All right. Any more questions for the letter before I move on? I guess we're good to go. All right. The third thing that we have in our curriculum is the idea of how when we are writing a directed writing, we may be asked to write a speech. Now, one thing that I want you all to keep in mind is that whenever we are given a speech, this is basically a response that is written keeping in mind that we are not writing for the sake of being read. We're actually writing a response that is meant to be something that is meant to be spoken out loud. So why does that matter? It matters because of the way we punctuate our response in terms of the way a speech is supposed to be delivered. Okay, so I will talk about that in just a second. Okay, what is a thesis statement? Okay, so a thesis statement is something that we already talked about in terms of some introduction. May introduce karte the idea that I'm writing this letter in order to share my the information I hold on the matter along with my opinions on this particular issue. ये जो मैंने एक statement में state कर दिया है that this is what my letter is going to be about. That's your thesis statement. Similarly, अगर मैं speech भी लिख रही हूँ, so obviously I will introduce to my audience that this is what I'm talking about, right? So that is your thesis statement, a statement that highlights the idea of what the entire text is going to be about. Okay, so I hope that answers your question. All right. So as far as the format for a speech is concerned, keeping in mind that a speech is meant to be spoken out loud, not just written on paper. We will begin our speech by obviously introducing ourselves and the question at hand. However, जब हम speech लिखते तो there are certain ways that we can incorporate techniques to make our speech all the more interesting. Now, a speech is very interesting because this is something that gives you the leverage to experiment with the way you write. All right. So, for example, आपका जो introduction है, इसमें you can use a lot of what if scenarios. You can begin with a quote. You can even incorporate personal anecdotes, personal experiences within your text to support what you're talking about. So basically the introduction, just the way we highlighted for other forms of writing, will definitely include the thesis statement. We will try to incorporate an idea that this is what the speech is going to be about. Rather than that, we will greet our audience. We will address them directly. We may begin with a quote, or we may begin with a what if scenario. Imagine you're sitting on a beach enjoying cold drinks with your friends. Wouldn't that be amazing? And if I'm writing a speech about traveling internationally, right? I can show you sample speech. I have it right here, so I will share that once I'm done with the format. Okay, so once we have talked about the introduction, we've introduced the idea of what this text is going to be about. We've welcomed the audience and everything. फिर आ जाता है हमारा body of the speech. Again, the steps remain the same. We read our reference text, we identify points of view, and we evaluate any ideas that we would associate with it. All right. Then I'm going to show you a question for a speech real quick so that can be our reference for the speech format. So for example, अगर हमने speech लिखनी है, write a speech for school leavers about attitudes to work. In your speech, you should evaluate the views and opinions about work given in both texts. Give your own views based on what you have read about what you consider to be a good attitude to work throughout a person's working life. So for example, if I'm writing a speech for graduates, so you guys are graduating and I'm writing a speech for you where I am trying to incorporate the idea of what is the best approach to a working life. Should you be a smart worker or a hard worker? Okay, so if this is what my speech is about, so directly, obviously, I'm gonna start off with a what if scenario, making my audience imagine what life could possibly be like 10 years down the line. And whether it's a positive or negative one, I can talk to them about how the choices you make in your life now will impact what you see 10 years down the line. And then when I come down to my body paragraphs, I will obviously incorporate all of the points that I have identified from the text, along with what I evaluated based on what is associated with benefits of hard work versus drawbacks of hard work. Okay? Okay, incorporating ideas from the text. Okay, no. Do not say according to text A or text B. Your response does not need to reflect the idea that this came from a text A or a text B or a text 1 or a text 2. Do not do that. Okay? You are incorporating these ideas as something that is part of your knowledge now. Okay? So you are reflecting on what you have read. Just keep that in mind. Do not mention text A. So once you have established that, you've mentioned your points of view that you have read within your text, followed by your own opinion on the matter, giving them advice on this is what the best approach is. So if I want to convince someone on a certain idea, it's always useful to give them both sides of the story and say, isn't this better? Because now they won't question why this is better. So whenever you are highlighting 2 points of view and then giving your own opinion and convincing them of the matter, which in this case you are, make sure that you do not negate what you have already said as the negatives or the drawbacks of hard work or smart work. Okay, so you've given your both your points of view A and point of view B, given your own opinion. The difference between a speech and other forms of writing is that here you have the opportunity to use a lot of various literary devices. You can use metaphors, similes, you can use quotes, you can use your own personal anecdotes. For example, a short example of how your life turned out better because you decided to do this, and give reasons supported by the text. So if you are talking about a particular scenario, support it with reasons from the text. Okay? You can use adjectives, use what if scenarios, use varied sentence structures. Speeches made this is very important because when you are incorporating various forms of sentence structures, what happens is you actually have pauses, you actually have descriptions, because again, this is something that is written for the sake of being read out loud. You're not writing this for the sake of being read. So one thing that I tell my students every time when they're writing a speech is that you should always save 5 minutes in the end, and with your response, imagine yourself reading it out loud. Do you think there are any pauses that you may have missed? Any exclamation marks that would have made your speech more interesting to hear? Because again, this is not something that your audience is reading. This is something that your audience has to listen to. So they have to sit through this speech, right? So have you made it interesting enough for your audience or not? Is it something that you would want to sit through? Or is it something that you would be able to relate to if someone delivered this speech to you? So these are some points that you must always keep in mind, and always save 5 minutes in the end to read your response. For all other forms of responses, I would say those 5 minutes are for punctuation and spellings, because a lot of students, when they're writing, they end up misspelling very common words that they would otherwise have spelled properly. Pehli baat. Secondly, if it's a speech, give yourself 5 minutes to imagine yourself reading it out loud to an audience. If you think that there should have been a pause here, or maybe I should have, said this, fix it. Because if you do not do that, you may end up writing a very generic, very redundant, very boring speech, which no audience might want to actually listen to. And that is what the examiner would have in mind. When they're reading your speech, they are imagining you delivering it to them. So keep in mind, a speech is meant to be heard, not read. Okay? You explained all points that you mentioned within your opinion with counterpoints. You can use facts and figures if they're mentioned within your text. You can also use personal experiences or anecdotes if that's something that fits your question at hand. Okay? Then you have your conclusion, in which you obviously restate a firm conclusion that this is the best way forward. Make sure that your conclusion, that's why I've divided it. The body paragraphs, these breaks that I have between these lines, this is supposed to reflect paragraphing. No form of writing is one big chunk of a paragraph. So it's never encouraged in proper English responses that you write as one paragraph. Chahe wo descriptive ho, narrative ho, article ho, letter ho, report ho, nothing is written in one paragraph. You always divide, because you're not talking about one idea. A paragraph is a break between ideas. And if you're mentioning such various contrasting ideas, how could you possibly write in one paragraph? You do not write in one paragraph. So make sure that you incorporate all ideas in separate paragraphs. Your conclusion, which is your concluding paragraph, is going to obviously restate what you're talking about. Make sure that you do summarize the idea that you started off with, but at the same time be a little firm, or use a statement that grabs the attention of the audience. You can even end with a quote in this case as well, if you haven't already done that in the beginning. So all of those strategies that apply to creating an effective opening also apply to creating an effective conclusion. Okay, so for those who believe that they have trouble keeping track of the points that they're writing, or they end up missing points, this is why I always tell students to spend 5 minutes with your text to plan out your response. So आपके जो insert है उसपे when you're highlighting ideas, you can try and make note that this is what I'm going to talk about first, this is what I'm going to talk about second. Okay, so if this is something that you have a lot of trouble with keeping track of your ideas, then it is always recommended to spend those 10 minutes initially to plan out your response before you actually start writing, and then stick to it. Because if you start confusing or second guessing yourself, you will end up writing a response that is confused, which is not clear enough for the examiner or the audience or the reader generally to understand. Okay? Okay, so a lot of people who have difficulty in formulating responses, basically, beta, the thing is, once you have highlighted those ideas, try to generalize them in your mind. For example, pehle jaise the text that we read about traveling to other countries, a point within that they talked about was education, that it's an educational experience. Now, when I don't want to restate that fact, because when I copy paste to karna nahi hai. So what am I going to do? I am basically going to take that idea of education and I'm going to associate all those ideas that I can think of that the word education bring to my mind. Education means to learn. Learn about what? If they're talking about travel, what can I learn from traveling? इस तरह उस idea को generalize करें so that you can formulate a general idea to write as your response. Okay, so I hope that answers your question, Rayan. All right. Any more confusions with the format of a speech? So one thing that we have to keep in mind is that when we are writing a speech, the introduction and the conclusion have to be very impactful, have to gauge the audience. It has to keep track of their, you could say, their attention. I want it to be interesting for them. I don't want an individual to have to sit through me delivering 300 to 400 words and be bored. All right. So our aim when writing a speech is to make it interesting for them. But at the same time, that does not mean we become informal. That does not mean that we use slang language, regardless of who my audience may be. This is still an examiner response. They will be reading it. So make sure. But Charian, I did just mention that this is your opinion paragraph. So once you have stated the positives and negatives of one thing, you will say, however, I hold the opinion, or I believe most of you would agree with my opinion that artificial intelligence is the future of our classroom. For example, if I'm writing a speech and my task at hand is to convince my audience that artificial intelligence use honi chahiye. So once I've given them the benefits and the drawbacks, I will say, however, I'm sure you will all agree with me when I say that artificial intelligence is the way forward. And I'll give reasons for that. So definitely you're giving your opinion. Because again, I'm going to take you back to the question real quick. Usme unhone likha hai that you have to give your opinion. Look at this. They're saying give your opinion on the matter. So please read the question very, very carefully. All the instructions are there. So you're always expected to evaluate and you're expected to give opinions or persuade on a matter, depending on the question. Okay, any more questions for the format of a speech? We just have reports left. Are we good to go with the speech format generally? Okay, I guess we are. All right. Now that we are done with all of those forms of writing, one thing that I would want to go over again would be the writing format for a report. Report writing is still going to incorporate the same ideas as we do in terms of opposing opinions or points of view, followed by our own opinion and recommendation. The one major difference between all forms of writing and a report is that this is the most formal form of writing, number one. Secondly, we have to incorporate a very generic title. I've given you guys a sample introduction to what the introduction for a report is supposed to sound like. So you're generally just talking about what the purpose of your report is going to be, followed by subheadings, which will highlight the various ideas that you incorporate. So for example, if the report is about animal testing, I talk about how the purpose of this report is to highlight the use of animal testing. This report also includes opinions, recommendations regarding the above issue. I'll give subheadings, which will highlight the idea of the information that I share, followed by my opinions and conclusion. So the information that I divide within this, the evaluation process remains the same. However, the format does change. So any confusions with the report format, or can I move on? All right, so I guess that's sorted. Before I move on to the composition section, I'd actually like to ask you guys, what do you want me to go over first, descriptive or narrative? Yes, it is compulsory to write subheadings for a report. It's absolutely necessary. Okay, so since most of you believe we should go over narrative first, so that's what I'm going to go over. Okay, so for the composition section, which is the second part of your, yes, your opinion, this is where your opinion goes in a report, in the opinion paragraph. So I divide all of the information that I have, followed by my opinion or recommendation, and then I give a conclusion, asking the individual or hoping that the individual will follow through with my recommendation. So conclusion में बस जैसे letter में आता है, इसे इधर आ जाए. Okay, so any more questions about reports? All right, I guess we're good with the reports then. Okay, so when we talk about composition, which is the second section of your writing paper, isme you are expected to formulate a response for 350 to 450 words, an essay, which could either be descriptive or narrative. Sanya Beta, what do you mean by only adding a heading? You do have to add a heading, but then you do have to add subheadings as well. Okay, so make sure that the subheading is there. It has to be. Okay, so when we are talking about composition, narratives, and descriptive, you'll be given two of each and you have to pick one. So it's one response. You will only be writing one of them, 350 to 450 words. When we talk about composition writing, I will go over narratives first. Let's skip through the descriptive. All right. So basically, when we are writing a narrative, which is a story, basically, yes, subheading for each and every paragraph, Ali. So when we are writing a narrative essay, this basically means writing a story. So one thing that I like to reiterate every time I talk to students about narrative writing is that you are writing a story which is supposed to follow a particular story arc. Okay. So whenever you are going over the, if you've ever seen a marking scheme as well for narrative writing, you'll notice that they talk about narrative elements. They use words like structure. These are basically the grading points of whether or not you've written an effective narrative or not. Iska matlab basically ye hota hai that your story is supposed to have a very clear and distinct, number one, opening, like you begin with something that makes sense as per the question. You have events that flow subsequently. And at the same time, you need to keep in mind that your response is supposed to cater to the idea that your characters are distinctly highlighted and they play an important part in the way your story runs. Okay, so you're supposed to have an introduction that highlights those characters. You are supposed to have a very clear and distinct setting. Okay, आपकी setting has to incorporate the idea of what your story is trying to say. So I think the best way to actually highlight what a good narrative is supposed to be is through an example. So I'm going to leave a sample on my screen for a second, and I want you guys to just read these three paragraphs. So I can comment on exactly how you can incorporate these ideas in any narrative that you write. So if you would all just take a minute and just read this. It's a question that says you need to write a story which includes the line, as they looked in the mirror, they were amazed to find two completely different people smiling back at them. So it's a sample from one of the papers. So just read this, and then I will talk about the elements that I just mentioned. Just let me know once you've read it, then we can move on with discussing the elements. All right. So basically, the response that's in front of you, this is one of a very well written response, I would say. It's a very good story that they highlight. There's more to it, but I'm just going to start off with the beginning and talk about how there are certain elements that we have to incorporate when we're writing a story. Now, no matter what the question states, in terms of the narrative, you'll either be given a title, you'll either be given a scenario, or someone just said that can we have a horror theme too? Now, if you notice the story that they've written here, it has quite a science fiction twist to it. Okay, so whatever you use in terms of your theme for your story, that is part of your additional elements. Your overall tone, your overall theme for your story, that is up to you. You can make it as humorous as you want. It can be a serious story. It can be a personal narrative. It can be completely fictional. You can incorporate elements of fantasy in it. All of that is acceptable as long as your story contains the basic elements of a proper beginning, middle, and end. There's a flow to your events. Thirdly, you have to make sure that there is some movement with your events. So if your events basically just dictate this happened and that happened and then this happened and then that happened. So if I just dictate, there was a boy, he entered the room, he saw this, and then he went to the table, he sat down, he ate his food. He did not like it, so he left his meal halfway. He got up and he left. Now, if I just state what's happening one after the other, then my story might not be very interesting. So as far as the plot is concerned, we need to incorporate interesting elements. So this is where the theme comes in. So if you incorporate elements of science fiction, if you make it supernatural, if you make it horror, like some of you would like to write, that's fine. You can do that. So the theme of your overall story, the genre that you choose to write, that's completely up to you. So if you look at the question here, it doesn't say that it has to be a true story. It can be imaginative, it can be realistic, it can be something that you may have experienced yourself. So the question says that you have to write a story that includes this line. Now, for those who have trouble coming up with interesting plots, the best way to do that is to try and imagine that particular title in your head. For example, yes, you can write fiction. Look at this. जब आपको मैंने composition का introduction दिखाया था, उसमें they say that you are basically writing on one of these, which is a narrative. It can be fictional, it can be imaginative, it can be something that you personally experience. So all of these apply. Is it okay? So a lot of students question whether it is acceptable to write about murder and blood and all of these things. Now, the reason why a lot of teachers discourage this is because students end up writing very cliched plots, which are technically, because I'm sure any of you may not have experienced these things yourself, right? So because you haven't experienced any of this yourself, you end up incorporating elements from movies that you may have seen or shows that you may have seen, which ends up either becoming a copied piece of text or it becomes very cliched. That's why a lot of teachers do discourage this. So it is encouraged to stick to a very simple genre as compared to such details. So there's nothing wrong with a story that incorporates these ideas, but the idea here is that you need to Ali, I don't understand your question. I'm not sure what you're trying to ask. So just keep in mind that no genre is incorrect technically, but it is not encouraged because you may end up lifting ideas from things that you may have seen. Okay, that is why a lot of teachers do discourage it, because it's not something that you have. Acha, okay. So the response I showed you, this is an A-star response. So the reason why I showed you is because I want you to see the flow of events. So you may not be able to incorporate all of these elements, but even if you incorporate some of them, you will definitely be incorporating brilliant response. because the thing that you need to focus here is that this text does try to highlight descriptions. It does try to make the reader vividly imagine that scenario. Okay, there is a flow of events. So yes, you can write in simple English, but that does not mean that you do not incorporate any descriptions. That does not mean you do not describe your scenario. So one thing that you do have to keep in mind is try to show instead of just telling what happened within the story. Okay, so there's definitely more to it. Okay, so a lot of students believe that there are certain techniques that you can incorporate when it comes to writing a narrative. You can start from your climax, but just remember, build towards it then. Circle back to it. Your story should be a complete narrative. It should not look like it has been left halfway. So yes, it is effective to start from the middle and then circle back to it. And a lot of stories begin at the end and then they circle back. It's a flashback sequence. So even that is effective as long as you do so effectively and coherently. There should be a flow in your events. Does the ending? Okay. The ending doesn't always have to be positive, but there definitely has to be an ending to it. I do think that this is going to be on YouTube. I'm not sure. It probably will be. Any important questions that you want to ask before you sign off? Because I know this has taken quite a lot of our time. So anything that you want to go over in terms of narratives? Anything that you don't understand? Okay. Anything about narratives or any of the formats that we have discussed? Any questions? So as far as a narrative is concerned, just make sure that you plan out your story. Idioms and proverbs are definitely allowed. They're actually encouraged. Yes, you can blend a universal plot. Okay, I will circle back to the previous formats. Is it okay? Point of view. I will answer that question because a lot of students are confused in what's the best point of view in terms of a story. This is the article format. If you want, you can take a screenshot. So as far as the point of view is concerned, first person narrative is always the easiest. There's no specific encouraged point of view. It actually depends on your story. For example, if I am trying to narrate a story where I am experiencing something, or it is something that is a very personal statement, for example, just say this question, they, so it's second person. So definitely it will be more effective if I stick to that, right? So it is better to write whatever point of view fits your story. So there's no preference of point of view. It's all about what the question demands. For students who believe that they have weak English, but obviously that doesn't mean that you should not be able to just okay. So as long as you are producing a narrative that has all of the elements that we have just talked about, you show an understanding of the topic at hand. You try and build a scenario around it. Secondly, you need to try and make sure that the overall story is a coherent one. Okay, so even if you're not using very elaborate English terms, आपने फिर भी अपने vocabulary जितने allow कर रही है, you incorporate descriptions, you incorporate details as vivid as you possibly can, that will definitely improve your grade. So just because you're not using very fancy words doesn't mean your story is a bad story. Simple stories can be effective if they are written effectively. So if you try and use those statements to create an effect in your story, and that's obvious, then you should be able to get a better grade. Okay, so it's not just about using fancy words, it's about using words effectively. Any more questions about what we have just talked about, or anything that you would want to ask me? As far as notes in this PowerPoint is concerned, I'll try and share that with Sarah. Okay, when it comes to planning out a narrative, I always tell my students to keep in mind this diagram, which is basically called the story arc as well. When you are this one. So basically, you need to know exactly where you want your story to start and where you want it to end. What kind of experiences do you want your characters to experience? It's always effective to have a conflict within your story. So that is something that if you incorporate within your rising action, as your story builds on, you create a conflict, and how that character reacts to that conflict, and how they, move on with life because of that conflict. So is tarah you will actually be able to plan out an effective narrative. All right, so I think we've taken a lot of time for this, so I'm going to pause right here. If you guys have any more questions, you can let Sir Ahmed know, and then we can maybe have another session on Sunday. Okay? All right, I'll let you guys off now. So if there's any questions, you can stay back. Otherwise, you're free to go from my side. I would actually suggest when you're writing your English paper, do it as calmly as you possibly can. Okay, so what I can do is figures of speech. I will try and share whatever resources I have on that. Okay, so whatever notes I have, I'll share them. Anything else that you'd like me to go over? Yes, you're free to go from my side. I'll see if I can share this PowerPoint with Sir Ahmed, and then he can share it with you guys. Okay. Okay, so the best thing in terms of sticking to the word limit is to try and club together ideas. If you think you're going to exceed word limits, if you end up talking about all the points, but you think some of them are more important than others, obviously prioritize those. But if you are able to identify points that are similar in terms of the inherent idea, then club them together. Isse aapki word limit bachegi. You should definitely use figures of speech in narrative writing. So do include them. As far as time is concerned, I always tell students to spare at least 15 minutes for the reading and correction process. So when you have 2 hours, 15 minutes are to be saved for that, 1 hour, 45 minutes. Your directed writing should not take you more than 45 to 50 minutes. And then the remaining time should be spent on your story writing. The best way to not exceed word limits in descriptive writing. Acha. So descriptive writing basically is the easiest to actually not exceed the word limit in, because if you, okay, so I'm not sure if you're familiar with the idea, but whenever you're describing a picture, there's this terminology where we use how you describe the foreground, middle ground, and the background. So if you just stick to these three, within 2 paragraphs each, you should be able to complete your task within the word limit. So imagine you're describing a picture, what's in the foreground, middle ground, background, and then go with that. I don't know, Sir Ahmed, is there any way I can share resources with the students? Any other questions for what I've talked about right now? Okay, so I'll try and see if I can share the resources with him, and then he can share them with you guys. Okay. I will share figures of speech as well. So I've taken note of that, and I will share them with those. All right, Allah Hafiz, kids. If you have any more questions, you can let Sir Ahmed know, and we can schedule another session. All right. All right. Thank you so much for being here, and good luck with your paper. All right. Thank you, everyone.